Welcome to the Asia Climate Capital Podcast, a series dedicated to tackling the business and finance of the energy transition and decarbonization in Asia, with the capital markets in mind. Today is episode 6 of the Asia Climate Capital Podcast. It was recorded on the 25th of April 2022. I'm your host, Joseph Jacobelli, and today's focus is on the business and finance of energy efficiency in Asia. My guest is James Maguire, who is a partner at Sustainable Development Capital LLP, also known as SDCL, and you can find more about Jim and SDCL in the show notes. Please note that all opinions and views expressed today are personal and do not represent those of current or previous employers. Enjoy the show. So today I'm really excited to speak to a very dear and old friend of mine, Jim Maguire, as I mentioned earlier, and we are talking about a really interesting and complex topic. Not that energy transition and decarbonization in Asia is not complex enough, but when it comes to energy efficiency, it's complex in the sense, in my view, that there's a lot of misunderstandings around it. And so that's the complexity. Just as a reference, almost over 10 years ago, the Asia Development Bank came up with a report basically stating that industry and buildings were responsible for 70% of total commercial energy consumption in Asia, and that they are further responsible for a remarkable 85% of electricity use in the region, and things really haven't changed very much in the past 10 years. So that's why I think it's really important to have a discussion around energy efficiency, especially from a capital markets perspective. So first of all, welcome, Jim.
Welcome, Joseph. How are you?
I'm very good. I hope all is well in Singapore. I wanted to start, Jim, if you don't mind, with a little bit about how you got involved into, and you're very directly involved into the energy transition in Asia. The whole decarbonization thing. I mean, your own kind of personal journey to energy transition.
Well, thanks, and thank you for the invitation to be here. My own personal journey into decarbonization, it really starts with the basic infrastructure in Asia. I came to or arrived in Hong Kong in 1996. My profession at the time was an insurance broker. So essentially, we acted on behalf of an insured, interfacing or engaging with insurance markets. And the area that I was engaged with most specifically was in and around large infrastructure projects. So that was everything from nuclear power stations in China to the largest coal-fired IPP in China to water treatment plants and so on and so forth. When I, in my role as an advisor, of course, and as the China economic growth story was taking off and you started to see more and more investment into the supply chain, one of the obvious targets as an insurance advisor was to look at a company like Walmart. And in terms of Walmart, it became clear that there was this massive opportunity, not only from an insurance perspective, but also just from what their impact was to the Chinese economy in terms of factories across the border from Hong Kong in Guangdong province. And obviously, in terms of just the sheer demand of retail and manufacturing activity that was going on just as a consumer of electricity. So those factors, those factories, the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, et cetera. And through the course of that early period, so that's essentially sort of the late 90s and the early 2000s, I came across an academic or a white paper, an academic piece of academic research that had been done by Lawrence Berkeley National Labs and Swiss Re. Swiss Re being one of the global leaders in the provision of reinsurance. And essentially the thesis of that white paper was, if you retrofit a building, if you retrofit that asset, you have an intrinsically better risk managed asset, you have better property loss control. And really, when we look and we talk about energy efficiency, and we'll talk about cooling efficiency as well, but what we're looking at and what we're talking about is industrial upgrading. We're taking plant and equipment that is maybe older and doesn't perform as well, or you're looking at, and this is really important in terms of cooling efficiency, you're looking at new technology, more efficient technology, or lower global warming potential refrigerants with regard to cooling efficiency. And you're looking at, taking old and replacing with new. And what you get is, from an insurability perspective, is a safer asset, a better risk managed asset. From a business perspective, and one of the things that became very clear with some academic research that was done by a gentleman named Dr. Niels Koch from the University of Maastricht, I believe, and who is probably better known today as the co-founder of GRESB, right, which is the leading property aggregator of information in and around property and real estate. But what that report that he put out subsequently was an academic research paper which said this makes business sense. In other words, if you and I, Joseph, we have a building on the same street and you do that energy efficiency retrofit and I don't, your building has higher occupancy rates, so more people occupying that building, that residence. You have higher leasing terms, and your capital valuation at point of sale or resale is higher. So the fundamental rationale for energy efficiency is simply really about expansion of margin, doing better by doing well, or doing well by doing better, however we want to term it. So the economic rationale is really kind of unequivocal. That data is there, not an opinion by me. So to go back, my journey in energy efficiency really starts in the supply chain in China. It starts with, how do you have a more efficient building that is a safer building, so it should have a lower premium. And what you see today, just to sort of jump ahead perhaps in your questions, what you're seeing today is sort of the manifestation is the financial community looking, and they're saying, wow, if we look and we talk about ESG, and I know we'll come to a number of other topics, but when we look at these topics, really goes back to first principles. A safer building, it's a better operated building, and it's probably more than likely, the data tells us, the research tells us, it's going to be a more profitable building.
And I think that's a really, really important point, because usually energy efficiency is mostly or purely, I should say, especially right now in Europe, associated with, if you have an insulated room or insulated house, then you save money. And when energy prices go up, then, you basically save money. But it goes well beyond that. I think that's kind of like the rhetoric that we're hearing right now because of, the high energy prices in Europe. So everybody's talking about insulating the houses, et cetera, and using less energy. But going back to you, Jim, I think, these points are all very, very important. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the company that you work for, because I think it's got a very, very interesting and I would say relatively unique background, because I don't think there's 300,000 SDCLs out there. So if you could, less of a pitch to a company pitch, but more a little bit about the background, especially on the fundraising side.
Yeah, well, listen, to try and minimize the pitch aspect and simply give you the background and history. We're founded in 2007 out of London, and it's a former banker, Jonathan Maxwell, who realized and or insightfully, with an enormous amount of insight, realized that this made sense. And again, it makes commercial sense, business sense, but it also makes sense in terms of what you mentioned earlier. What are the contributors to greenhouse gas emissions? What do we have to attack to decarbonize, whether that's Asia or whether that's Europe or the UK or the US or globally? Any very astutely identified energy efficiency, right? So essentially was, I think we could probably argue, as one of the first, certainly from a financial investor perspective, if not the first, to say, yeah, we can make a go of this from a commercial business proposition, from an investor perspective. So, we met in 2008, 2009, Jonathan, myself, and the then head of the region for SDCL. For me, it was absolutely serendipitous to come across someone who actually thought that energy efficiency was as good an idea as I thought it was. And so we started, and I, as I mentioned, I had this idea about the supply chain and how we could do supply chain carbon risk management, right? Not just looking at this from a supply chain and an investor and protection of those manufacturing facilities. And essentially, we came together and had this idea of, let's talk to this global retailer called Walmart, who is so influential in that issue of the supply chain, and how do we address that issue in Guangdong province specifically at the time. Obviously the financial crisis 2008, 2009 slowed a few things down around the world, but from an SDCL perspective, continued to have the engagement, continued to look at opportunities in China, but also then closer to home in the UK, in England, in Ireland, etc. And so we really, the journey sort of continued looking at energy efficiency, first in the built environment, sort of hospitality, and then slowly started to look at other aspects of if you will, renewable energy and energy efficiencies of biofuel and larger industrial energy efficiency projects. And I think where the inflection point came was really then how do you tap into capital markets in a more meaningful way, and maybe a less convoluted way. And I think it's just important. We had really looked at sort of that classic GP/LP or fund approach. And then about 2-3 years ago now, I guess we looked at the public markets, and we are the first energy efficiency investment vehicle listed on the London Stock Exchange. That entity is called C-CEP, and we've raised now, I think it's about slightly north of 1.1 billion sterling. So we're overall now looking assets under management of greater than 2 billion US, not to mix our currencies. We've done an IPO in New York, a SPAC, that is called the SPAC Edge. Again, IPO'd at 200 million US, and we're looking very seriously and aggressively at opportunities in this space in the US. And last but not least, out of Dublin, we have just recently had a first closing on our Green Energy Solutions Fund, which will be a Dublin platform focused Europe and the United States as well. So C-CEP has a bit of a remit, which is more global. Edge is probably more specific to the US, but also Europe. And then B.S.F. or Green Energy Solutions Fund, probably a little bit more Europe than to the US. Mixing and matching what's greenfield focus versus sort of late stage or operational investment focus.
So you've done a standard IPO, then you've done an IPO through a SPAC, and then you've raised the fund. And all of those three things are amazing because the subject matter here, or the reason why you raise the money is energy efficiency. And I think that's quite unique and definitely not that common these days. Moving on to the second part of the conversation, Jim, if I can kind of pick your brain on, your chosen kind of current issue that we want to kind of get more deeply into, and I think that I guess the key would be cooling efficiency in Asia. So could you tell me more a little bit about your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So again, as I've just articulated, the broad approach has been around energy efficiency. And again, I think, the question of what are we trying to solve when we talk about energy efficiency? We're trying to look at the way energy is generated. We're trying to, make it more efficient, or take a process which is, maybe been less or inefficient with the loss of energy occurring. You've got large transmission and distribution lines, et cetera, distances, you've got distribution losses. And so what we're looking at is how do we get closer to that end user? How do you get to, on site, if you will? And so what we're looking is, how do we deliver cheaper, cleaner, more reliable power, right? And I think the key issue is really kind of, for us, it starts with something called the Kigali Amendment. The Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol is more focused on HFCs or hydrofluorocarbons, right, which are thousands of times more dangerous, worse for the environment than carbon. And for us living in Asia, it's about heat, right? It's about a warming planet. It's about cooling degree days. And so when we talk about cooling efficiency, we're talking about how do we deliver on-site more efficiently cooling and or refrigeration. So that's where you're going to get the sort of the two key aspects to the Kigali Amendment are about reducing by 80% the production and consumption of HFCs. Again, it's using lower GW or global warming potential refrigerants, and it's about delivering that energy more efficiency using the lower GWP refrigerants and really making a decided impact into the issue of greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think what's really important for us living in Asia, it's different than if you're up in the northern UK or the northeast of the United States, where it's really a heat issue. For us in this part of the world, it's about cooling, and we have to, if we look forward, we hope that the pandemic is going to be put to one side, and we'll be able to move forward with economic recovery more aggressively. So then we have to look at what's Asia. What does Asia represent? Asia represents a growing population for most of the key markets or key economies. We're looking at greater urbanization, right? So you have more people moving into the cities. And when we've got that population, we've got more urbanization, and we hope that we'll see economic recovery, which is meaningful. We see a trajectory which will continue to Asia will represent a growth economy, growth economies. People will start buying more air conditioning. And what we really have to be cognizant of is, what is that impact? What is looming? Right? And if you just take the use of data centers, and I think, certainly for what you're seeing in your discussions, just the growth in data centers across the region right now. And that's literally Japan, Korea, down to Australia. So we're in this dynamic where the expected consumption of electricity is got a pretty significant upward trajectory. More people moving into the cities, economics, recovery, success, growth. Boy, we're looming in this part of the world potentially towards a real perfect storm. And when SDCL, we were awarded a grant under what's called the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, right, which was an initiative put together, a philanthropic initiative put together out of the United States, and some work that was done as part of the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program, which was done jointly with the economists, and they looked at the cooling imperative, and they looked at Asia, and we looked at when you look at the data that they came out with. India is looking at cooling degree days of 181, potentially 180, right? And that's 36 degrees Celsius or hotter. Indonesia, we were looking at about 120 plus days. And forgive me, I don't have the exact number. So when we talk about cooling and we look at Asia, the impact is potentially pretty significant. And that's where we've got to sort of get our arms around this, this concept of the first fuel, this concept of more efficient use or production and use of energy. And therein lies the conundrum for us right now, though, in the region, because probably more money right now in Singapore and Hong Kong going into Bitcoin. As we all know, solar is solar is solar, and solar is sexier in this part of the world, right? Everybody can see that rooftop solar, they can see that utility scale. And so we've got a lot of work to do in terms of education and getting a deeper and broader understanding of what the value of energy efficiency is and cooling and energy efficiency from our Asia perspective.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely monstrously important. The education part is monstrously important. I mean, if you take data centers alone, I mean, we know that the world is using increasingly more data, and as many of the economies like you mentioned, I mean, I think something like 15% of electricity consumption in Asia is from developed Asia, and about 85% is from developing Asia, and the developing Asia is developing. That's the point, right? So they're going to be using, for example, more data. And data centers, as far as I remember, there was a number that is always in my brain, which is it uses something like 7 kilowatt hours per gigabyte. And if you think how many gigabytes go through the data center every second or every half second, it's an enormous amount. So could you talk maybe a little bit about some examples? Because I think, I don't know if you agree with me, Jim, but I think the big difference is when we talk about solar, it's it's a relatively straightforward equation, right? You buy your panels. I'm here in my house in Hong Kong. I've got a few panels. It's less than 9 kilowatt system, but they put it up in 5 days, right? So it's very easy to explain, relatively straightforward to do. Especially if you do a lot of it, then it becomes kind of like like toasted bread, so to speak, in terms of putting it up. But could you explain maybe a couple of examples on EE, and because I think it's a little bit more complex than putting up a couple of panels over one's home.
No, absolutely, and again, therein lies in part the one of the sort of the principal, I don't want to say barriers, because energy efficiency is occurring in Asia and has occurred, but it takes a bit longer, I think, for corporates in the region to get their arms around. Well, what do you mean that you're going to own the chiller and you're going to provide that to me for a period of time, and then we're going to hand it over? And I guess the best way to sort of walk you through is what we've done a number of here in Singapore. We've done a number of energy efficiency projects, just sort of, if you will, dipping the toe in the water over the last 5-8 years. What we were looking at as part of the Kigali initiative was to try, how do we deploy this plant and equipment at scale? And I think that's probably what sort of the first point I'd raise. What we were looking at, how do you do cooling as a service? But how do you do it not just one building? How do we go through, and what's the opportunity pool to do 100 buildings? Right, or 100 manufacturing sites. So again, and part of what we were looking at within that Kigali was we were looking at sort of 4 main segments. We were looking at the manufacturing sector, right? So I mentioned earlier that supply chain, the Walmarts of the world, the Targets of the world, or any entity with a large number of factories supplying or providing the consumer goods or whatever it might be. We were looking at healthcare, right? The healthcare sector, hugely important, and important not only just from not only just from a carbon perspective, but also from building resiliency into those assets. How do you make sure that you've got not only more efficient, but better, more resilient hospitals or healthcare facilities? And I just quickly add, one of the big issues for us in Asia is that, and this came out of the pandemic, was the understanding that basically healthcare infrastructure, that cold chain, if you will, the ability to keep medicine cool or cold in countries such as Vietnam or Indonesia or the Philippines, where you've got, I think it's 18,000 islands in Indonesia, 7,000 plus islands in Philippines. The length of Vietnam, just geographically, you've got some real challenges just on that issue, right? So healthcare is super important, and then wholesale retailing, logistics, that becomes an easy opportunity. To be clear, what we've seen and what we continue to see is a strong focus on the solar, the rooftop solar in that space. But what we try, the pitch, if you will, that we're making is listen, it's great. Rooftop solar is going to help you. It's going to help you reduce your generation, et cetera. But what we're looking at is how do you really understand the utilization of energy within your asset, all right? And then last but not least was hospitality. For this part of the world, hugely important. And what we saw and where we started our journey on cooling efficiency in the region initially was in that hospitality space, working with the global brands, right? Global hospitality. And I think one of the lessons learned, and I'll just give you, in terms of a case study, when we look at hospitality and we think of the large brands, whether that's a Hilton, a Marriott, or Intercontinental, or Accor, et cetera, we think that this is a fairly, straightforward process. And clearly, the majority of the major global hospitality brands are laser focused on cooling efficiency or energy efficiency. But the actual hospitality sector is slightly more challenging because these are franchises in many instances, and in fact, I think arguably in majority of the instances. And so they'll be locally owned, right? The actual global brands don't own, right? So you'll have what are called brand standard issues, et cetera. And within that context, what we saw in the early days in 2019, we were seeing a real disconnect between what were the objectives of the global hospitality brands and then what was the reality on the ground with that owner. And that sort of creates a dynamic where, well, how do you, again, remember I said earlier, we're looking at financing at scale. We don't want to do one asset by one asset. We want to run and look at this on a standardized approach, facilitize and deploy capital at scale to create a more profitable business for that that hotel, or for the brand itself. But we also, what we're trying to do is create an environment or create a model where it's not just about the single asset, it's about that portfolio approach, right? And that just allows more efficiency. It allows us to deploy capital at scale in a much more meaningful and efficient way. We ran into, as I'm sure you can guess, we ran into then in January, February, March of 2020, the pandemic. And that, unfortunately, had a really significant impact to what we were trying to do in the hospitality sector. And primarily around, obviously, you just simply weren't getting the same number of visitors to Bali or a Bangkok or the islands in and around Asia. And for us, it was an erosion of credit quality, that counterparty credit quality, which for us is important, right? We own and operate the chiller or the air conditioning units or the LED lighting. We're selling energy as a service or cooling as a service. And from a counterparty credit, investable, investment grade counterparty, we were running into some dynamics that were challenging. And that's where I think for the last 18 months, 24 months for us, the biggest issue has been that, either the perception of risk or the credit risk or the credit risk themselves, because, certainly in hospitality, we've seen a real impact of no people traveling. You're just simply seeing some enormous reductions in visitors to certain places, which, 2018, 17 would have seen full complements of tourists. So that's been a real problem. The savings, the investment grade audits, just to be clear, Joseph, the investment grade audits that we did in hospitality in Indonesia, we were looking at reductions as much as 45%. In fact, I believe there was one hotel, we were looking somewhere around 53, 56%. So replacing chillers, moving to more and lower GWP refrigerants, we were looking at some significant potential savings. And those were investment grade audits, which were done by international ESCOs, energy services companies. We were super confident for global brands, but yet the actual occupancy rates were single digit in some instances. So that's, for us, it's a challenge. And I just want to, again, you made a really good point. It's about we're looking at bits and pieces. It's about engineering. It's about improving the technology, et cetera, but it's also about the credit. It's about the payment or on a monthly basis for the use of that air, that cooling air. So it is different. It's different than putting a solar panel on your roof and hoping for sunny days.
Just if you could give us an example. I mean, no commercial secrets, obviously, but if there's a very large resort, and we've got plenty of those in Asia, adopts some energy efficiency measures. You pointed out that the energy savings can be 40%, 50% of the current usage. But in terms of general payback, what kind of timeline are we looking at?
Yeah, so great question. So what we were looking at for that particular project, we were looking at a tenor of about 5 years. The payback was slightly less than that. The contract tenor was going to be about 5 to 7 years. We were looking at, as I said, energy reduction of 45%. The capex on that particular project was just over $500,000 US. But our kilowatt savings were targeted at $1 million, 1.2, and the per annum savings were targeted at about US 100,000, just over US 100,000. So that was just one hotel, in a world famous resort. So I think you may not see that if we look at a factory in Singapore. We may not see the same level of savings and the same level of performance metrics. But really, having looked at this topic from an insurance perspective first, and then from a more operational investor perspective, the rule of thumb typically when you're replacing, old for new is in my experience has always been 20%, 19, 20%, 15, 20%. So it's again, I've made reference to it earlier. We're talking about what's going to impact positively the environment. How do we address this issue of decarbonization, as you articulated at the very beginning? And I think one of the points that I would like to really convey to you and your listeners is that this is about good business as well. And I don't think the message of energy efficiency and how it not only are we going to reduce our carbon in that hotel, but that owner, right, from a net operating income basis, he's going to do a lot better, right, a lot better on an annual basis. And let's just say, because they're paying us for our role in the process, and we've got energy services companies that have to fund the investment grade audits. But what's important to highlight is that then at a certain point they take over we sell them back the plant and equipment, and we're talking chillers. This isn't a 5-year exercise for a chiller, right? These are 20 years and whatnot. So the economics around energy efficiency are typically really good.
Before we move on to kind of like your outlook and your crystal ball gazing, so to speak, just one more question on EE in Asia. So I presented in a few different forums something that I call the energy pyramid, and at the bottom of the pyramid is government regulations, government policies, government institutions. Above that is the financing of whatever it is that you want to do in the energy transition. Above that is the cost, what it costs you, and also the cost to the user. And finally, you achieve net zero. So that's the rough kind of pyramid. It's a podcast. I don't have a picture of it, so it's a bit difficult to explain. So at the bottom, you've got government, then you've got the second section is financing. The third section is the cost. And then finally, you get the net zero at the point of the pyramid. Now, when it comes to so the point I'm trying to make here is that you really need governments to drive the energy transition in general, whether you're talking about promoting solar, whether you're talking about energy efficiency. So in Asia, and assuming that you agree with me that that's kind of like the starting point, in Asia, where do you see more excuse the pun, efficient governments? Which governments are doing a more efficient, more effective in the promotion of EE? And I've got a specific question specific reason to talk about that, and that is because in my experience, looking at the power markets in Asia for the last 35 years, there's always a lot of talk. Singapore and Hong Kong were examples, but then when it comes to action, it's been very, it's been very, very slow. I think Singapore has done a little bit better than Hong Kong, comparatively speaking. China has done better than Hong Kong as well. Mainland China. So just running through Asia very, very quickly, where do you see the more kind of progressive and efficient governments?
Trying to remain as politically neutral as possible in answering that question, but all kidding aside, I think as you know, and for our listeners, I lived in Hong Kong for 25 years, and there's an enormous amount of discussion about energy efficiency. I think to date, it's simply been not as successful, perhaps, as it could have been. From a Singapore perspective, and again, I'm loath to get into the Singapore versus Hong Kong debate, but I think it's absolutely fair to say, and this is again not opinion, it's just data, that the regulatory frameworks that Singapore has been putting in place in respect of energy efficiency have been superior, and they continue to be. As a resident now for just over 6 months, what we see is absolutely lateral thinking and understanding about the importance of energy efficiency. And I would go so far as to say, when I've mentioned cooling efficiency, that it's not a term, it's not a concept which is as well known or as well articulated, right? I think, you and certainly most of your listeners will know energy efficiency, certainly that phrase has been around for quite a while, and it has a long history. So from a government support perspective, I think, absolutely my view would be right now, I think Singapore is very much setting the pace. They get it. They get the issue of HFCs within that discussion of energy efficiency. Other countries, I think clearly the Philippines. Philippines has been, and I think they had a long journey, but just last year, just passed some fantastic regulatory regulations in terms of energy efficiency. I think there's a growing and active ESCO market there, both international and domestic players, and I think you'll see capital allocated and interested in going into the Philippines. And again, I just want to if I can go sideways for 1 second, if you look at the Philippines and you look at this issue of energy efficiency, what we're also talking about is building resilience into assets. And I think that's important to highlight. And if you look at a country like the Philippines, which will have a typhoon or two on a fairly regular basis, castigated by natural events, I think that, and again, 7,000 islands, I believe, the infrastructure around healthcare, the infrastructure around cold chain food security. So while we look at those issues from a Philippine perspective, and this holds true for Vietnam, which I'm going to come to next, you need to make sure that you're approaching this in the right way. There's no reason to do logistics for cold chain, for food security, or for pharmaceutical products, and do it the way it should, was done 10 years ago. We should be looking at the use of chillers, which are lower GWP refrigerant chillers. We should be looking at plant and equipment, which is more efficient, right? And that is proven technology in the market. Right. So I think Philippines is right up there at the top. I think Vietnam has ratified the Kigali Amendment. And within the discussion, which is a wide and certainly within the region, a super topical in Vietnam and how it's moving. The solar program gets a lot of attention. Now you're looking at both offshore and onshore wind development in Vietnam. And again, talking about LNG and gas and depending on one's view of the transitional aspects of gas. But there is a super proactive approach to energy management in Vietnam right now. And I think that's a huge positive for anybody, for us as investors, for anybody that's looking at putting capital into assets into Vietnam. I think from a North Asia perspective, I'd suggest Korea certainly has been right there at the top. Taiwan, certainly it's topical, apart from offshore wind and whatnot. And then for us, within what we're looking at, sort of the geography of Asia Pacific, certainly Australia is enormously appealing. I would suggest, as we're starting to dip our toe into Australia, what we're seeing is still a big focus on solar, but a absolute awareness and growing awareness of what the value of energy efficiency represents potentially from an Australian perspective.
But the Australian example is actually quite interesting, because I've written a few commentaries about the fact that at the federal government level, actually, you don't really have a lot of support towards the energy transition and decarbonization. They were late to the table in terms of putting some targets on 2050 targets. But what some of the state governments have done has been absolutely amazing. And so Australia's had a very, very good, very strong renewables and energy efficiency track record, not because of the federal government, but because of the state governments. So it's a very, very interesting place. So moving on the conversation to the third part now, which is, taking out your crystal ball and just really telling us, based on your decades of experience, where do you see the future the opportunities in the future around here in this particular region?
So it's a great question, and I guess I think I'd highlight a couple of issues. One, I'd just say what's the impact of the pandemic in this part of the world, and it has been quite substantial, quite substantive. And what I've written about is that we need to look at this as an opportunity, right? We need to look at how we can recalibrate and promote decarbonization. So I've mentioned a couple of times the cold chain. At this point, if you look at Vietnam and Indonesia, the Philippines, and those are just three of the countries which are easiest sort of to think about because of the geography, right? The 7,000 islands if it's the Philippines, or 16 or 18,000 islands if it's Indonesia, and Vietnam, just the length of the country. How do we drive economic recovery? I mentioned earlier, urbanization, population growth. We're looking at a warming world. We can capture, if you will, and drive economic recovery when we take a more laser focused, when we allocate capital, when governments, whether it's state or federal, drive technology forcing regulation that's going to promote the development of cooling and energy efficiency. And that'll bring to a rural part of Vietnam, hopefully, both food security implications, but also pharmaceutical or medicine or healthcare implications, and using more efficient cooling technology. Right? So I think there's a recalibration of how we think about energy efficiency from a, if you will, if you'll forgive me, from a branding perspective, from a marketing perspective. Let's think of energy efficiency apart from the fact that it's hopefully driving safer, right? To go back to my original interest was it's going to be a better loss controlled asset. It's going to be good for the environment, right? Help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the academic research, right? Dr. Nils Koch, what they did was they said, this is good business, right? You're going to improve your net operating income. So I think one, let's look at how we come out of this pandemic in the region. How do we drive more efficient use of cooling technology? I think, and if I can give a shout out real quick, I think there's been a positive bump coming out of the COP26 because the IEA statistic about 40% of greenhouse gas emissions are derived from the built environment. That statistic, as you well know, and it varies, right? Some years it seems it's 32 or 35 or 36%. I don't think it's gotten much over 40. But that statistic, as I think you know, Joseph, better than most, that's been around for a while. So at COP26, and then as I think you and your listeners will know, for the first time ever in the history of a COP, energy efficiency was mentioned in the concluding document. So if you're a sports fan, it's better to go 1 for 26 than it is 0 for 26. So I think that there is a greater awareness right now of what's going on and what the importance of the built environment is in this process of decarbonization. And the more solar, the more wind and hydrogen, and I think that from my perspective, that's all super positive. We also need to just, with laser focus, look at the built environment more closely, and that's where we need to think about. I made a joke earlier. Solar is sexier. Well, let's look at the asset, that built environment. How do we improve the built environment to make its impact in terms of carbon less than what it's been historically? I think that there's definitely new market entrants in this part of the world. There is new capital providers coming in. There are new ESCOs or ESCOs that have been here that are expanding. I know one international ESCO, which has been primarily in Hong Kong for the last decade. Now they're looking at Malaysia, Singapore, and other markets. I think this awareness, the growing corporate awareness on ESG has, for many people, it's about barbecues and orphanages, the social side, and there's critiques about what corporates are actually doing in terms of ESG. But I think my sense is that corporates in the region are starting to figure out, well, this is important. And again, I'd go back to it. If you can run your business from an estate perspective or a portfolio perspective, using less energy and saving money, which contributes to your bottom line, I think that the corporates are starting to see that and understand that better. And I guess the last thing I would say is I'd go back to the comment I made earlier. In this part of the world, in Asia, we've got some significant heat issues to think about. We've got cooling degree days, which seem to be occurring more. You may remember there was in Hong Kong a number of years ago, one of the national meteorological Hong Kong Meteorological Association or Society, they made a comment, in Hong Kong, we're like the frog in boiling water. So we have to keep in mind that, and again, and I apologize just to go sideways, I come into this from an insurance perspective. I come into this from natural catastrophe events that impact a large infrastructure project in a given country in Asia. And what are the insurance implications of that? Both from the insurance of the property, but also from either the delay in startup of that project or the business interruption, the loss of revenue, right? So I come at this from a slightly different perspective, and it's a perspective really of weather and climate change. And remember, from an insurance perspective, Joseph, you typically hear it's frequency and severity. The other angle or the other aspect of weather changing is, what if we just start having more rainy days or rainier rainy days? And we're looking at basic infrastructure development across the region. The impact, whether it's heat, so at 36 degrees, the labor has to put down their tools for 3 hours. Or if it's too wet, if you're getting certain millimeters of rain, and from a safety perspective. So the impact is quite significant. And that's going to have implications because I said earlier, right, we're looking at hopefully economic recovery, economic growth. We're looking at populations which are, in some countries, they're static or declining even, but we're going to see largely population growth. And then we've got this issue of urbanization. More people moving into the cities, driving increased consumption around air conditioning, driving the need for greater refrigeration. So we've got a bit of a perfect storm that's brewing for us here in the region, and we need that. We need the legislation. We need corporates to come together, and we need capital to look at how to invest in more cooling and energy efficiency or distributed generation projects.
And what you've been saying so far, Jim, strikes me as these elements are already started. I mean, the train has already left the station, right? It's not like governments are just sitting there wondering, pondering whether we should do something or not about EE, or corporates trying to get their head around about what investment in EE investments are. I mean, it's already happening, and as we stated earlier, I mean, obviously it's happening more in some countries and a little bit less in some other jurisdictions. But at the end of the day, the locomotive has already moved. And one interesting thing is that kind of neighbors always look for each other. I mean, obviously Vietnam is looking at the Filipino experience, Filipinos are looking at the Indonesian experience, and so on and so forth. It's not completely insulated. But one interesting question from me is, in my personal experience, is I looked at Korea versus Japan. And again, we don't want to get political here. We're just talking about corporates and what corporates have done so far in terms of energy efficiency investments. And it strikes me that Korea has, achieved quite a bit, or maybe they just advertise it better, whereas Japan has been a little bit slow. So despite the kind of aging and falling population in Japan, is there like real opportunities in that particular country over the next 5 to 10 years in terms of investments?
So we have looked at opportunities in both Korea and Japan. We have within our sort of ecosystem of investors, Japanese investors that have been a part of our journey for north of a decade, I believe. I think my sense is, and again, I'm not going to call winners and losers here. I think my own personal experiences, I think you've got a sector in Korea which is extremely lateral thinking on the need to be more efficient in terms of the sources of electricity generation, and you have capital in Korea that is super active, and that includes the insurance industry, candidly, the life insurance industry, which for many years has been putting, investing in infrastructure projects in Korea, as I'm sure you know. I think in Japan, I think that, my sense is they're certainly focused on wind and solar, perhaps energy efficiency, not so much. But and again, that's probably a byproduct of how the economy is organized, and what the expertise is for an energy services company. Where's the capital going to come from either a bank side or a developer side? And I think it's probably more the structure of just that property real estate market. Again, if we say the built environment, according to the IEA's, the last chart was, I believe, about 30. It was actually technically, I think, about 38% of greenhouse gas emissions are derived from that property sector. My sense, and I am not an expert on Japanese real estate in any way, shape, or form, but I think that you've probably got some very traditional players there, who may not be thinking about the need to be more efficient in their energy utilization, as they are, for example, right now in the city of New York, or in Denver, or in San Francisco and Los Angeles, markets that I know a little bit better. And capital is going into those markets. I think what we represent, and I said it at the beginning, we've got two public equities, public markets investments, platforms, one in London and one in the US. And there's a reason for that. I think we see those two markets as potentially, hugely important to what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I really hope that Asia catches up. But I mean, going back to Japan, I mean, I've got fond memories. Those old days when we were allowed to travel, as opposed to now. You go to Tokyo and you get into this brand new building, which has won accolades globally for being extremely energy efficient, won lots of prizes, et cetera, et cetera. And then next door, there's another building that was built 10, 20 years earlier, where the air conditioning is faulty and all sorts of things. So it's quite, I would say, from a non-expert point of view, I think that there would be quite a few opportunities there. But Jim, I just wanted to ask, do you have any kind of final words, especially on the current and future of cooling?
Well, I mean, first off, I'm optimistic. I'm super optimistic, and as someone who's looked at this topic for north of 15 years, we're moving now in directions that, though painfully slow, I'm really pleased to see. I think that's the first point. I think there, certainly in recent discussions, SDCL, we led a side event in Edinburgh in and around COP26, and the amount of enthusiasm, the amount of discussion about how do we address these issues was, even sitting in Edinburgh in November, was pretty impressive. I think that, as I've said a couple of times now, it comes back to the climate and the weather, and I think we have to do more faster. We need more bankable projects faster to sort of get to the decarbonization, to get to decarbonization in a way that's going to be meaningful and impactful for us here in the region. And I'd say two final points, right? I think the HFCs the HFC role in this discussion is not as well understood. And I encourage, you as a thought leader in terms of this topic, broadly decarbonization, that is, we all need to do better in understanding where this fits into the value chain of discussion on decarbonization. Again, that IEA statistic is not a new statistic. We've known for many years that the built environment has a fundamentally important role in terms of the decarbonization process, and we have to do better. And that would be, sort of my key point. One aspect of this we've not even talked about, Joseph, is how do you handle the waste management? Because we know in Hong Kong, and in fact, an article in the Straits Times here in Singapore a few months ago, right? We don't know how contractors are handling these refrigerants as you're taking air conditionings and you're taking out old and putting in new. So that waste management aspect, again, for us in Asia, that has a China aspect to it, here to Indonesia, so important. Indonesia is just fundamentally important on this discussion of cooling efficiency. And then to India, right? Because India, again, as I said, the Economist Intelligence Unit, it's a fantastic study that they did back in 2019. You're looking at potentially 181 cooling degree days. That's 36 degrees Celsius or higher in India. And I think, forgive me, I think it's about 2040 or 2050. So we're, candidly and being blunt, Joseph, probably not so much an issue for you and I, but certainly for generation, the one that's immediately following, and then for children today, that's a huge discussion, because the implications of that on healthcare, on food security, migration are just awesome. So we've got a lot of work still to do. I'm optimistic that we're finally getting to an inflection point. Maybe not the exact inflection point, but sadly, it's probably going to take a super typhoon in a country here in the region that's going to really do some damage, where people are going to start to figure out, well, we really do need to act on this. And I hope that doesn't happen. I hope that we can get the capital mobilized, and I hope we can get corporates incentivized, and I hope that we can get governments, both on a federal or a national and on a state or provincial level, to start understanding the importance of energy efficiency and cooling efficiency.
So really what it is, I mean, the technologies are there, the knowledge base is there, the capital is there, but we go back to something I've mentioned in a few of the podcasts. At the end of the day, it's education. We're not talking about education, just at the primary school level, but all the way to, senior managements in corporates, with governments, and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, if there's a much better understanding, then things can move forward quite much faster, especially given that we do have the technologies, we do have the people, we do have the ESCOs, we have the capital available as proven by SDCL. Capital can be raised. So we just gotta get it done and get a move on.
Can I just leave you with 3 final points my side, right? You just need to look at the data, right? And these are not opinions, this is data. Just look at where natural catastrophe events are globally or specific to the region. Go to the insurance companies, the Swiss Re's or the Munich Re's of the world. They've got plenty of data. The insurance brokers have got plenty of data on it. The second issue is go to the data on the business advantages. And that's Dr. Nils Koch, who I know best, and I simply from, I don't know him personally, but I just know the research. And just look at that. Again, that's not an opinion. It's analytics around performance of assets in North America, right? It's US and Canada data, to be fair, but it's data. It's not an opinion. And then last but not least, you made a comment there about the schools. We are looking at one project right now in Hong Kong, and it is a school. And it's not necessarily, I gave you a summary at the very beginning. I talked about manufacturing and healthcare and hospitality, et cetera. Education wasn't a part of that. And we have stuck with this project because we believe it is actually fundamentally important that the kids at that international school in Hong Kong, that they understand what is a cooling degree day? What is energy efficiency? Why is this important that someone comes in and finances, hopefully, right? Hopefully, a project to replace all the air conditioning units in that school? Because we have to get to a point where this is more a part of the conversation than it is now. And that's on all levels. So it's absolutely on the government level, it's on a corporate level, it's on the sector, right? The value chain of participants, you mentioned ESCOs and investors, but it's also at that level where the kids are saying, I don't want to have air conditioning units in my school if they're using higher GWP refrigerant. And when we get to that point, then we're going to make then we'll be at the inflection point. Would be my view.
No, those are very good 3 points. Well, Jim, thank you very, very, very much for your time. Very, very grateful. For more details on SDCL, you can listeners can refer to the show notes. There'll be a link there. And so once again, thank you so much for your time, Jim. Very, very grateful.
Thank you, Joseph. I appreciate it, the opportunity. Take care.
I trust you found the conversation useful. As always, feedback is really key. And in order to make the content useful and relevant to you and other listeners, please do give us some feedback. Also, please like the podcast in whatever podcast app you use, and send us your comments, your thoughts, your ideas for topics anytime at the Asia Climate Capital Podcast at gmail.com. That's the Asia Climate Capital Podcast at gmail.com. Thank you.